previous two practicals we saw an example of a motherboard with an AT form factor. In this case we're going to be looking at a motherboard with an ATX form factor. Hopefully this will help you spot some of the similarities and differences between the two types of motherboard. To make the picture clearer, we've extracted the motherboard from its housing entirely. First we see the dual row of ATX power connectors. Next we can see the CPU with the fan and heatsink above it. To the left there are two slots for DIMM memory modules. Moving to the left again, we can see two IDE connectors and a floppy drive connector. You may also be able to see the slots cut in these connectors. Next we can see the CMOS battery, and above that the BIOS chip. In the middle we can see the chipset with its own heatsink. Above that we can see 4 expansion slots, 2 PCI slots, an AGP slot, and finally a proprietary slot which was used for a modem. On the right there are a number of integrated ports. In this next section we're going to see how to connect the floppy drive to the motherboard. To do this we take a floppy drive cable and connect it to the 34-pin output on the motherboard. Note that the cable can only be connected one way. The top of the cable corresponding to the pin 1 connection is marked in red. Now we show how to make a connection from a hard drive to the motherboard. This time we take a hard drive cable and connect it to one of the two IDE connections on the motherboard. Note that the cable can only be fitted one way, and that the side of the cable corresponding to pin 1 is marked in red. Now we're going to examine the BIOS chip a little more closely. We can see from the manufacturer's information on the chip that it's an AMI BIOS chip, one of the leading brands of BIOS chip. Now we look at the CMOS battery. We'll also see how to remove and replace it. To remove the battery, find the slot in the holder and use a screwdriver to gently lift the battery out. To replace the battery, simply slide it under the metal catches and push it gently into place. You may need to do this if you've lost the CMOS password and need to reset it. Now we examine some of the integrated connectors that are built into the motherboard itself. On the right we see a games port and some audio I/O connectors. Next to these we find the 15-pin display adapter, a 25-pin printer connector and a 9-pin serial connector. Further to the left we see a 10/100 base T network adapter and 2 USB ports. Finally we see 2 6-pin mini DIN connectors, the green one for the mouse, the purple for the keyboard. We end this tour of the motherboard by taking a closer look at the ATX power supply connector. The ATX connector supports 20 cables in 2 rows of 10. Notice the lug on the connector, which allows it to be fitted only one way. This corresponds to the little catch on the motherboard side of the connector. We've now looked at some of the main features of both the AT and the ATX format motherboards. Apart from the practical use of what we've seen, you should also be able to identify these features in an exam.